June 30th, 1830. Morning light fell through windows that had cost more than most men would earn in a lifetime. The architect stood in the unfinished palace, watching workmen lay stone that would never bear his name. His protector was dead. The treasury was coming. John Nash had estimated the transformation of Buckingham House would cost £252,690. The actual figure stood at £496,169. The building was still incomplete. Within weeks, Parliament would dismiss him. Within months, newspapers would call his work vulgar excess. Within 5 years, he would die in debt on the Isle of Wight, his reputation destroyed by the very building that should have crowned his career. This is the story of how Britain built its most expensive home. Not through careful planning or modest ambition, but through royal fantasy colliding with impossible mathematics. The palace that became the symbol of British monarchy almost bankrupted the men who built it and sparked parliamentary inquiries that ended careers. If you enjoy investigations into British architecture and the costs behind royal grandeur, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which royal residence to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let us begin. The man who would build Britain's most expensive palace was born on January 18th, 1752 in Lambeth, the son of a Welsh millwright. This heritage would matter. Throughout his life, Nash held on to his Welsh connections, returning to Wales when London rejected him, finding work among Welsh gentry when English aristocrats would not employ him. His father's trade as millwright meant Nash grew up understanding mechanics, weights, structures, how things stood up and how they fell down. This practical knowledge would serve him better than formal classical education. At 14, in 1766 or 67, Nash began training under architect Sir Robert Taylor, one of London's most successful practitioners. For 10 years, Nash learned the profession, drawing elevations, calculating dimensions, managing craftsmen, understanding the business of architecture. He completed his apprenticeship in 1775 or 1776, 23 or 24 years old and ready to establish his own practice. On April 28, 1775, at the now demolished church of St. Mary Newington, Nash married Jane Elizabeth Kerr, daughter of a surgeon. He seemed positioned for success. He worked as surveyor, builder, and carpenter, developing properties in Bloomsbury. In 1778, he began a speculative development project at 66 Bloomsbury Square, designing a 6-house terrace that would be clad in stucco, an innovative material for London buildings. He moved into the end unit himself with his wife. Success appeared certain. The marriage was a disaster. By 1778, Nash discovered truths that shattered his young practice. His wife had not been pregnant when she claimed to be. She had faked pregnancies entirely. She had imposed 2 children on him as his own, children who were neither his nor hers, but acquired through methods Nash never explained publicly. She had accumulated debts approaching £300, including a single bill for hats totaling £300 alone, a sum that could have purchased a small house. The betrayal was total. Nash started divorce proceedings in 1780. The Bloomsbury development project failed financially. Creditors circled. Nash could not pay what he owed. In 1783, at 31 years old, he was declared bankrupt. The court proceedings were public. His reputation was destroyed. London's architectural establishment, never welcoming to outsiders, closed ranks against him. Nash fled to Wales, professionally ruined, personally humiliated, financially broken. But Nash possessed something rare among failed men. He could reinvent himself completely. Wales became his refuge and his training ground. For 14 years, from 1783 to 1797, Nash rebuilt his career stone by stone, house by house, connection by connection. He worked for Welsh gentry, who cared less about London scandal than about getting distinctive country houses. He developed a style called picturesque, designs that embraced asymmetry and irregular beauty over strict classical symmetry. Where classical architecture demanded balance and regularity, picturesque architecture celebrated variety and surprise. Blay Castle in Gloucestershire, Loscombe Castle in Devon for Charles Hoare, the well-known banker, Ravensworth Castle in Yorkshire, Carehays Castle in Cornwall. Each commission rebuilt Nash's reputation. Each house proved he understood something other architects missed: how buildings should sit in landscape, how stone and nature could become one composition instead of stone dominating nature or nature overwhelming stone. His picturesque designs felt inevitable, as if they had grown from the land rather than being imposed upon it. At Blay Hamlet, Nash created what architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner would later call the ne plus ultra of the picturesque movement. 9 small cottages, each unique, arranged so that, as Nash insisted, a woman standing in her doorway should not be able to see any of the other 9 doors. The cottages featured thatch roofs, dormer windows, brick chimneys, rough stonework, hipped roofs. These features became the blueprint for the quintessential English country cottage, influencing design for generations. Nash was creating more than buildings. He was inventing a way of seeing and a style of living. Somewhere during these Welsh years, Nash met and married Mary, though the exact date remains unclear. Mary would bear 5 children during their marriage. Nash never acknowledged them as his own. London society, when Nash returned, would whisper that the children belonged to his royal patron. Whether this was true or merely the resentful gossip of rivals would never be determined. And what mattered was that Nash had a new wife, a restored reputation, and a distinctive architectural voice. By 1797, Nash felt ready to return to London. He was 45 years old. Most architects at that age settle into established practice. Nash was about to begin the work that would make him famous. Through landscape gardener Humphrey Repton, Nash returned to London practice. The partnership proved fruitful. Repton handled landscape, Nash handled architecture, and together they created complete environments where house and grounds formed unified designs. Then, around 1800 or 1801, through contacts with Charles Edward Fox, Nash was introduced to George, Prince of Wales. The prince was 38 or 39. His father, King George III, was descending into periods of madness. The prince served as heir but held no real power. He could not govern. He could not implement policy. He could not leave his mark on Britain's direction. But he could build. And in building, he could express everything he felt about power, magnificence, and his own importance that politics denied him. Nash recognized this immediately. Where other architects saw a difficult client who changed his mind frequently and demanded the impossible, Nash saw a man desperate to make something permanent in a life that felt provisional. The prince had waited decades for the throne. He had lived as heir apparent since birth in 1762. By 1800, at 38, he had been waiting his entire adult life to become king. Building gave him a way to act while waiting. George, Prince of Wales, was 48 in 1810 when he began commissioning Nash to design what would become Regent Street and Regent Park. The prince had waited decades to exercise power. His father, King George III, had descended into madness. The prince served as regent, ruling in his father's name, but denied the throne. He poured his frustrated ambition into buildings. Nash understood this. Where other architects saw a difficult client, Nash saw a man desperate to leave his mark on London. The partnership produced 2 miles of London's most dramatic urban design. Regent Street connected Carlton House to Marylebone Park, creating a ceremonial route that said everything about power and display that the prince could not say through governing. The prince loved it. Nash had found his protector, but rumours circulated. A cartoon appeared in 1820 showing the half-dressed king embracing Nash's wife Mary with a speech bubble, reading, "I have great pleasure in visiting this part of my dominions." Mary had given birth to 5 children during her marriage to Nash. Nash never acknowledged them as his. London society whispered that Nash owed his success to his willingness to share his wife with the prince. Whether true or merely the resentment of rivals, the scandal stuck. Nash's rapid rise looked suspicious. From bankruptcy to royal favour in less than 20 years. People wanted explanations. Meanwhile, the building that would become the centre of scandal sat quietly in St James's Park. Buckingham House had been built in 1703 for John Sheffield, Duke of Buckingham. Architect William Wynd designed a large townhouse facing the park, positioned to dominate the view along avenues laid out by King Charles II. The house cost £7,000. Sheffield died in 1721. The property passed through several hands before King George III bought it in 1761 for £21,000 as a private residence for Queen Charlotte. The royal family called it the Queen's House. 14 of their 15 children were born there. Between 1762 and 1776, architect Sir William Chambers remodelled the house for £73,000. Ceilings designed by Robert Adam. Paintings by Giovanni Battista Cipriani. Sophisticated rooms that made the house suitable for a queen. But it remained just that, a house, not a palace. The official royal residence stayed at St James's Palace, where ceremony and state business happened. Buckingham House was where the royal family lived privately, away from court formality. George III spent increasing amounts of time there, using his wife's residence to escape the rigid etiquette of the king's apartments at St James. This pattern, using the Queen's house for private life, followed centuries of royal tradition. George III died in 1820. His son, who had ruled as Prince Regent since 1811, finally became King George IV at 57. He had grown up in Buckingham House. He knew every room, and he wanted something grander. Britain had defeated Napoleon. British industry was transforming the world economy. British ships mastered the oceans. The king believed his palace should reflect this power. He believed Buckingham House should become Buckingham Palace. In 1820, Nash received the commission to renovate Buckingham House into a suitable royal residence. The initial plan was modest. The king wanted comfort, not overwhelming grandeur. A small palace for private use, while St James remained the official seat of monarchy and ceremony. Nash drew plans for enlargement and renovation. Parliament reviewed the proposal. They approved a budget of £150,000. This seemed generous. The work began with optimism. The early stages proceeded normally. Workers cleared existing structures. Stonemasons assessed what could be saved from Chambers' earlier work. Carpenters evaluated floors and framing. The plan called for extending the house, improving the staterooms, modernising systems. Standard renovation work for a royal residence. Parliament felt confident the budget would suffice. Then, in 1826, 6 years into the renovation with considerable work already completed, the king changed his mind completely. He no longer wanted a comfortable home. He wanted a palace. Not just any palace, but a statement. Something that would announce his reign as the culmination of British triumph over Napoleon, British dominance of world trade, British industrial transformation. The house he had grown up in would become a monument to British greatness and his own magnificence. Nash, always ready to please his patron and aware that refusing would end the commission, agreed to the transformation. The change meant everything. Converting a house into a private residence required renovation, working within existing structures, updating and improving. Converting it into a state palace required demolition and reconstruction. The difference in cost and complexity was enormous. Nash faced a choice. He could tell the king the transformation was impossible within budget, risking royal displeasure. Or he could proceed, believing Parliament would provide more funding once work was underway. He chose to proceed. Nash retained the main block of Buckingham House, the 1703 core by William Wynder that George III had purchased in 1761. But he doubled its size, adding a new suite of rooms on the garden side facing west. These rooms would serve as state apartments, spaces for receiving foreign dignitaries, hosting ceremonies, demonstrating royal power through architectural splendor. The scale increased dramatically. Ceilings rose higher, rooms grew larger, decoration became more elaborate. He demolished the north and south wings entirely, structures that had stood since the 18th century. Demolition created enormous waste and expense. Materials that could not be reused had to be removed from the site. Then Nash rebuilt the wings on a larger scale around a courtyard, creating a U-shaped structure that enclosed space for ceremonial gatherings. The external facade received stone facing from quarries near Bath in Somerset, 115 miles from London. The Bath stone, a warm, honey-coloured limestone, could be carved beautifully and reflected the French neoclassical style that George IV preferred. Transporting Bath stone to London required complex logistics. Each block had to be cut at the quarry, loaded onto wagons, hauled to the nearest canal or river, loaded onto barges, transported along waterways to London, unloaded and carted to the building site. Weather affected every stage. Rain delayed quarrying. Floods stopped river transport. Frost cracked stone. Each delay added cost. The stone itself was expensive. Transport doubled or tripled that cost. Installation required skilled masons who commanded high wages. At the centre of the courtyard, Nash designed a triumphal arch, the Marble Arch. This was not merely decoration. The arch would serve as the imposing entrance for visiting dignitaries, featuring images of recent British military victories, celebrations of Trafalgar and Waterloo carved into white marble. The marble came from Carrara in Italy, transported even further than Bath stone. The cost of the arch alone reached £34,450, nearly a quarter of the original budget for the entire project. Parliament had initially agreed to £150,000. When Nash informed them that the enlarged scope required more, the king pressed for £450,000 as a more realistic figure. This was 3 times the original estimate. Parliament resisted. The king insisted. Eventually, Parliament reluctantly agreed, believing this would cover everything. Members voted for the increased budget with the understanding that this was final, that no more money would be requested. They were wrong. Nash worked with extraordinary speed, driven by multiple pressures. The aging king's impatience was constant. George IV was not a healthy man. Years of excess, rich food, heavy drinking, lack of exercise had destroyed his constitution. He was enormously overweight. He suffered constant pain. He knew time was limited. He wanted to see his palace completed before death. This urgency shaped every decision Nash made. Speed over careful planning, spectacle over structural consideration, the king's approval over prudent accounting. The architect was also 74 years old when work intensified in 1826. Most men that age have retired. Nash was managing the largest project of his career while dealing with his own declining health. He relied increasingly on clerks and assistants to handle details. William Nixon, whom Nash described as the most diligent, attentive, and the most honest clerk of the works that I have ever met with, supervised much of the actual construction until his death in 1826, the same year The project's scope expanded. Losing Nixon at that critical moment removed Nash's most reliable manager on site. By 1828, just 2 years after expanding the scope, costs had reached £400,000. The palace remained far from finished. Whole sections existed only as framing. The roof was incomplete. Interior decoration had barely begun. Plumbing was not installed. Heating systems were planned but not built. The beautiful staterooms everyone would later admire existed as empty shells. Parliament demanded explanations. How had £450,000 been spent with so much work remaining? A select committee investigated. Nash appeared before Parliament. He defended his work, his accounting, his decisions. But the numbers told a damning story. Some work had been done hastily and needed rebuilding. Single-story wings proved structurally unstable and required reconstruction. Changes to plans midway through construction meant discarding completed work. The king's constant alterations created waste. Every time George IV changed his mind about a room's purpose or a facade's details, money was lost to undoing and redoing work. By 1829, the cost stood at £496,169. Some accounts put it even higher, at £613,269, depending on what expenses were included. Either figure represented disaster. The palace was still incomplete. Staterooms lacked furniture. Service areas were unfinished. The east side remained open, with Nash's marble arch serving as entrance but no wing to complete the enclosure. The building functioned more as expensive construction site than as palace. The work itself was extraordinary, both in ambition and execution. Nash created staterooms that remain virtually unchanged today, 200 years later. The white drawing room, where mirrors and gilt create an environment of reflecting light. The music room, with its domed ceiling and perfect acoustics for chamber performances. The blue drawing room, leading processionally toward the eventual ballroom. Each space was designed for maximum theatrical effect. Rooms that flowed into one another through double mirrored doors that could stand open for grand receptions. When all the doors opened, visitors could see from one end of the palace to the other, a vista of gilt, mirrors, crystal, and elaborate plasterwork stretching hundreds of feet. The scale impressed everyone who saw it, even those who criticized the cost. The craftsmanship was undeniable. Nash had assembled teams of the finest artisans Britain and Europe could provide. Italian plasterers created ceiling decorations of extraordinary complexity, scrollwork and rosettes and mythological scenes molded in plaster that would be painted and gilded. French furniture makers supplied chairs, tables, cabinets of quality that matched anything in Versailles. British craftsmen provided mahogany doors, window frames, floor parquet. German metalworkers created brass fixtures, door handles, window latches. Every element came from specialists chosen for their mastery. The workers laboured in shifts that extended from dawn until darkness. Stonemasons cut bathstone to fit Nash's designs. Each piece measured precisely to create facades where joints between blocks would be nearly invisible. Plasterers created elaborate ceiling decorations, standing on scaffolding for hours to mould wet plaster into forms that would harden into permanent beauty. Carpenters built doors and windows, frames and panels, each piece fitted so precisely that gaps measured in fractions of inches. Glaziers installed glass panes, some of enormous size for the period, transported carefully from manufactories where sand had been melted and formed into transparent sheets. The site employed hundreds of workers at peak construction. Each man needed paying weekly. Wages for skilled craftsmen reached levels that concerned Parliament. A master mason earned perhaps £4 per week, over £200 per year. A journeyman mason earned £2 10 shillings per week. Labourers who mixed mortar and carried materials earned perhaps £1 per week. With hundreds of men working, weekly wage bills reached into hundreds of pounds. Annual labour costs consumed tens of thousands. Each material needed purchasing. Stone required quarrying fees, transport costs, and payment to the quarry owner. Timber came from Baltic ports, transported by ship, paying for wood itself, plus shipping, plus duties, plus cartage from London docks to the building site. Lead for roofing and plumbing came from mines in Derbyshire or Wales, smelted and shaped into sheets or pipes. Iron for structural supports, brass for fixtures, copper for gutters and downspouts. Each metal purchased from different suppliers at different prices in different markets. Managing procurement across this range of materials required full-time staff who did nothing but order, receive, inspect, and account for supplies. Inside the rising walls, other workers installed systems that would make the palace functional. Kitchens had to be designed to feed hundreds. The cooking equipment alone represented major expense. Iron ranges large enough to roast multiple sides of beef simultaneously. Ovens that could bake dozens of loaves. Copper pots in graduated sizes, from small saucepans to cauldrons holding gallons. Storage for food, both perishable goods that needed cool cellars and dry goods that needed protected pantries. The kitchen complex occupied substantial space in the palace basement, with dedicated access routes so servants could move between kitchens and dining areas without being seen by royal family or guests. Heating systems presented enormous challenges. The palace was vast, rooms numbered in the hundreds. British climate meant heating was essential most of the year. The technology available in 1829 was limited. Each major room required a fireplace, which meant chimneys throughout the building, which meant structural complexity. Fireplaces needed flues that drew properly, which required careful calculation of dimensions and angles. Get it wrong and rooms filled with smoke. Many of Nash's fireplaces did get it wrong. The chimneys smoked so badly that fires had to be allowed to die down, leaving rooms cold. Victoria would later complain that the palace was barely habitable during winter. Plumbing brought water up from the Thames through networks of lead pipes. The technology was advancing but still primitive by modern standards. Pressure had to be generated by pumps, which meant machinery, which meant maintenance. Water closets were being installed in upper floors, revolutionary for the time, but prone to failures that created unsanitary conditions. Drainage carried waste away through underground sewers, but the systems never worked efficiently enough. Smells permeated parts of the palace. Ventilation was so poor that the interior had foul odours that no amount of perfume or flowers could mask entirely. The scale of work created its own problems. Coordinating hundreds of workers across dozens of simultaneous tasks required management skills that exceeded what Nash's office could provide. Different trades needed to work in sequence. Masons finished walls before plasterers could start. Plasterers finished ceilings before painters could work. Painters finished before furniture could be installed. But the king's demands for speed meant trades overlapped, creating conflicts. Painters worked in rooms where plasterers had not finished. Furniture arrived before paint dried. The rush to complete caused quality problems that required fixing later, adding more cost. Nash kept records, but they were not adequate for a project of this scale. He recorded major expenditures, but not all the small purchases that accumulated into large sums. He tracked contracts with primary suppliers, but not all the supplementary materials bought as needed. His accounting satisfied normal architectural practice for country houses, but proved insufficient for Parliament's scrutiny of public spending. When investigators later examined the books, they found gaps, ambiguities, transactions that lacked proper documentation. Nash insisted this was normal for construction projects, that perfect records were impossible when hundreds of decisions happened daily. Parliament saw incompetence, or worse, the political dimension complicated everything. George IV's unpopularity meant any spending associated with him attracted criticism. Newspapers attacked the king regularly. Political cartoons mocked his weight, his mistresses, his extravagance. His attempt to divorce Queen Caroline had created a scandal that dominated public attention for years. His lifestyle was notorious. Stories circulated about his drinking, his gambling, his lavish spending on personal pleasures, while ordinary Britons struggled with economic hardship following the Napoleonic Wars. Against this background, spending £500,000 on a palace was politically toxic. Opponents of the king used the palace as a weapon. They argued that George IV cared nothing for his people's welfare, only for his own glory. They pointed to the spiralling costs as evidence of aristocratic excess that needed checking. They demanded investigations, transparency, accountability. Each parliamentary session brought more questions, more criticism, more pressure. Nash found himself defending not just his architectural decisions, but the king's character and priorities, tasks for which he had no training and no defence. George, Prince of Wales, was 48 in 1810 when he began commissioning Nash to design what would become Regent Street and Regent Park. The prince had waited decades to exercise power. His father, King George III, had descended into madness. The prince served as regent, ruling in his father's name, but denied the throne. He poured his frustrated ambition into buildings. Nash understood this. Where other architects saw a difficult client, Nash saw a man desperate to leave his mark on London. The partnership produced 2 miles of London's most dramatic urban design. Regent Street connected Carlton House to Marylebone Park, creating a ceremonial route that said everything about power and display that the prince could not say through governing. The prince loved it. Nash had found his protector. The staircase alone demonstrated Nash's ambition. A grand ceremonial route rising through the centre of the palace, wide enough for processions, decorated with gilt and marble. The ballroom, added in the final phase, measured 120 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 45 feet high, making it the largest room in the palace. At one end stood a throne beneath a domed velvet canopy. Everything about the design said power, wealth, permanence, everything except the accounting. Nash kept records, but they were incomplete. He spent money as the king demanded, trusting that Parliament would continue funding because stopping would mean wasting what had already been spent. This logic trapped everyone. Each year, more money poured into the unfinished palace because walking away would mean admitting that previous spending had been wasted. The sunk cost grew larger, Parliament grew angrier, but they kept paying. George IV never lived in his palace. His health declined as the building rose. By 1829, he was often too ill to visit the construction site. He received reports from Nash, descriptions of progress, promises that completion was near. The king must have known he would not see the finished building. Perhaps that drove his insistence on grandeur. If he could not live in the palace, at least it would stand as his monument. On June 26, 1830, at 3 o'clock in the morning, King George IV died at Windsor Castle. He was 67 years old. He had reigned for 10 years. His palace was unfinished, massively over budget, and politically toxic. The death came after months of declining health. George had been overweight and ill for years. By 1830, he could barely walk. He spent most of his time in rooms at Windsor, seeing few people, conducting little business. When death came, it surprised no one. What surprised people was how quickly everything changed for John Nash. Within hours of the king's death, the protection that had sustained Nash's career for 20 years vanished completely. The new king was George IV's younger brother, who became William IV. William was 64, practical, uninterested in his brother's architectural fantasies. He preferred Clarence House, built to his specifications years earlier. When told about the enormous palace being built at Buckingham House, he showed little enthusiasm. The project had been George's dream, not William's. The new king saw no reason to continue indulging it. The architect was 78 years old. His patron was dead. His building was a national scandal. Parliament, which had been restrained by respect for the dying king, now felt free to act. Within weeks, committees were formed to investigate the palace expenditures. Nash was summoned to explain himself. How had a project budgeted at £150,000 cost over £496,000? Where had the money gone? Why was the building still incomplete? Had Nash profited improperly from his position? The select committee that investigated Nash in August and September of 1830 was thorough and hostile. Members questioned every aspect of his work. They examined contracts with suppliers. They reviewed payments to craftsmen. They scrutinized his accounting methods. They found what they considered inexcusable irregularity and great negligence in his contracts and accounts. Nash's record-keeping, which he insisted was standard practice for architectural work, looked like incompetence, or worse when examined by parliamentary investigators trained in government accounting. The committee also investigated Nash's financial interest in some public projects. Had he used his position to enrich himself? During the Regent Street project, Nash had owned property along the route. When the street was built, his properties increased in value. Was this corruption or simply good investment? Nash argued he had invested personal money in properties that might have become worthless if the street project failed. Parliament saw conflict of interest. Then there were the persistent rumours about Nash's wife Mary and the king. The cartoon from 1820 resurfaced, the one showing the king embracing Nash's half-dressed wife. The 5 children Mary had borne during their marriage, none acknowledged by Nash. The whispers that Nash had shared his wife with the prince to gain favour. Whether any of this was true became irrelevant. The perception was toxic. Nash's success appeared to rest on pimping his wife to royalty rather than on architectural talent. The investigation's conclusions destroyed what remained of Nash's reputation. The committee found that costs had spiraled due to Nash's poor management, inadequate planning, and willingness to accommodate the king's constant changes without regard for budget. They found his accounting inadequate. They found his oversight of contractors insufficient. They found his explanation of expenses unsatisfactory. While they stopped short of accusing him of theft or fraud, the implication was clear. Nash had failed in his duty to protect public money. Parliament dismissed Nash from the Office of Works in November 1830. This was not merely removal from the Buckingham Palace project, it was termination of his entire relationship with the government. At 78, Nash would receive no more royal commissions, no more public projects, no more work of any significance. The architectural establishment, many of whose members had resented Nash's rise for decades, celebrated his fall. Sir John Soane, Sir Robert Smirke, Geoffrey Wyatville, all of whom had received knighthoods for their work, watched Nash dismissed without honours, his career ending in disgrace. The contrast was deliberate. Soane, Smirke, and Wyatville represented establishment architecture, men from respectable families with classical training. Nash was an outsider, a bankrupt who had rebuilt through cunning and royal favour rather than through proper channels. His fall confirmed what the establishment had always believed, that shortcuts led to disaster, that proper procedures existed for good reason, that men like Nash, who circumvented those procedures, eventually paid for their presumption. They removed him from the Palace project entirely. Edward Blore, younger at 43 and cheaper in his estimates, received the commission to complete what Nash could not. Blore was everything Nash was not. Stable, reliable, careful with money, capable of finishing projects within budget. Blore was given £100,000 to complete the palace. He would succeed where Nash failed, proving that competent management could have avoided the entire disaster. Nash retired to East Cowes Castle on the Isle of Wight, the home he had designed for himself during his years of success. The castle stood on a hill overlooking the Solent, a picturesque fantasy of towers and battlements. Nash had built it as his masterpiece of domestic architecture, the house where he would live as a successful gentleman architect. He had hosted extravagant parties there during the regatta, celebrations of wealth and status that brought the fashionable world to his door. Those days were over. The architect spent his final years watching his reputation disintegrate. Newspapers that had once praised his urban designs now called him a failure. The palace he had created was described by politician Thomas Creevey as a specimen of wicked, vulgar profusion. Other critics attacked the building's aesthetics, calling the design tasteless and the execution shoddy. Every criticism of the palace became a criticism of Nash. He had no defenders. The establishment architects who might have spoken up for his talent chose silence. The king who had commissioned the work was dead. Nash was alone. On March 28, 1835, observers noted that Nash was very poorly and faint. This was the beginning of the end. His health, never robust in old age, was failing. On May 1st, 1835, his solicitor, John Lyon, was summoned to East Cowes Castle to finalise Nash's will. There were debts to account for, properties to dispose of, arrangements for Mary to make. Nash lingered for nearly 2 more weeks, growing weaker each day. John Nash died on May 13th, 1835. He was 83 years old. He left behind debts that Mary would spend years settling. She had to sell his art collection, paintings and sculptures he had acquired during prosperous years. She sold his library, books accumulated over a lifetime of study. She sold furnishings from East Cowes Castle. Eventually she had to sell the castle itself, the house Nash had designed as his legacy. The buyer demolished it and built something else. Nash's domestic masterpiece disappeared as completely as his reputation. The irony was bitter. Nash had shaped more of London's appearance than any architect since Christopher Wren. Regent Street, Regent's Park, the terraces that surrounded the park, Carlton House Terrace, Trafalgar Square, the Royal Mews, Marble Arch, Buckingham Palace. His buildings defined Regency London. Tourists still walk streets Nash designed, but Nash died disgraced, denied the knighthood that less talented architects received, remembered as the man who had failed to control costs rather than as the visionary who had transformed a city. His obituary in Gentleman's Magazine acknowledged that no man ever produced such vast and splendid improvements as Mr. Nash had done between Pall Mall and Regent's Park. But the praise was overshadowed by the scandal. The palace remained his monument and his failure, inseparable. Everything Nash had achieved led to that one disastrous project that destroyed him. The palace he left behind told a different story than the one George IV had imagined. Yes, it was grand. Yes, it demonstrated British power and wealth, but it also demonstrated something else, the impossibility of sustaining such grandeur. The palace required enormous resources just to function. Heating it was nearly impossible. The chimneys smoked so badly that fires had to be allowed to die down, leaving rooms cold. Ventilation was so poor that the interior smelled foul. When gas lamps were installed, there was serious concern about gas build-up and fire risk. The beautiful rooms were often uncomfortable to occupy. Queen Victoria became the first monarch to live in Buckingham Palace in July 1837, just 18 years old and newly crowned. She left from the palace for her coronation in June 1838, beginning a tradition. But within 8 years, she was complaining to Prime Minister Robert Peel about lack of space. Her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840 highlighted the problem. The palace had no nurseries, not enough bedrooms for visitors, no proper accommodation for a growing royal family. The solution was to build a 4th wing, closing Nash's courtyard and creating a quadrangle. The Marble Arch was moved to Hyde Park, where it stands today. The cost of this new wing was covered by selling the Royal Pavilion at Brighton for £53,000. Edward Blore designed the new East Wing, completed in 1847. It enclosed the forecourt and created the main entrance still used today. The central balcony on this facade was Prince Albert's suggestion. From there, Queen Victoria saw her troops depart for the Crimean War and welcomed them home. That balcony became the stage for royal appearances, the place where the family greets crowds during celebrations. It was not part of Nash's original design. It was an adaptation forced by the building's inadequacies. Inside, the palace operated as a vast household. By the Victorian era, the servant hierarchy was elaborate and rigid. The Lord Chamberlain, Lord Steward, and Master of the Horse headed 3 departments that divided responsibility for different aspects of palace life. But their duties were ill-defined and created confusion. When Baron Stockmar complained that the dining room was always cold, a staff member explained, "You see, properly speaking, it is not our fault, for the Lord Steward lays the fire only, and the Lord Chamberlain lights it." The male and female servants, having no master in the house, came and went as they pleased, committing many excesses, with no one to correct them. Eventually reforms imposed order. A housekeeper managed female staff. A butler managed male staff. Below them ranked the footmen, pages, housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, each with specific duties. The housekeeper ensured that maids rose early to attend first to Victoria and Albert's private apartments. She managed the storeroom filled with preserves, cakes, biscuits, and linens. She kept accounts and reported deficiencies. On May 12, 1856, housekeeper Eliza Jane Thornton wrote that the linen has been again gone over, and the deficiency of towels and dusters remains the same. The work was exhausting. Housemaids began before dawn. They cleaned bedrooms, made beds, emptied chamber pots, refilled coal buckets, swept floors, dusted furniture, attended to fires and candlesticks. They cleaned glass and china. They answered calls from the mistress. They relit bedroom fires in the evening. They tidied bedrooms while guests were at dinner. They made up fires for the night. Finally, they retired. A good housemaid knew that there is a right and wrong way of doing things applies even to so simple and prosaic an act as that of cleaning a bedroom candlestick. Lower servants ate plain food in the servants' hall, sharing small dark rooms in the attic. Wages were low. A housemaid might earn £25 per year, roughly $2,700 in modern equivalent. A butler earned £40 to £60 per year, $4,300 to $6,400. The house steward, not technically a servant but a professional manager, earned £50 to £100, $5,500 to $11,000. These wages seem modest, but in 1890 they represented decent income for working-class employment. What made large staffs possible was cheap labour. The average servant earned a mere £25 per year. Cheap labour sustained the illusion of effortless grandeur. The costs mounted constantly. Staff wages and room and board, food for hundreds of people, coal for heating, candles, and later gas for lighting, maintenance on the building, which was always needed, repairs to roofs, walls, floors, windows, repainting interiors, replacing carpets and drapes, maintaining the gardens, which required their own staff of gardeners, operating the royal mews with horses, carriages, and coachmen. Every aspect of palace life consumed money. Annual operating costs reached levels that shocked those who examined the accounts. But royalty could not appear to economize. The palace existed to demonstrate power through display. Garden parties hosted thousands. State banquets required elaborate settings with the grand service. Silver gilt plate made in 1811. The diplomatic corps received in November each year with all staterooms in use. Investitures honoured citizens with awards. Foreign heads of state visited with full ceremony. Each event required staff, preparation, expense. The mathematics were impossible to balance. The monarchy received funding through various arrangements. Initially, the civil list payments that covered official duties. But palace upkeep, travel, and other costs came from different sources. Sorting who paid for what became a constant negotiation between the royal household and Parliament. Meanwhile, the building itself was deteriorating. By the early 1900s, the soft caen stone that Edward Blore had used for the East Front showed serious deterioration from London's notorious soot. The stone was blackening and crumbling. In 1913, the decision was made to reface the facade. Architect Aston Webb received the commission. He chose Portland stone, harder and more weather-resistant. Preparing the stone took 12 months. The actual refacing took 13 weeks, including removing the old stonework. The work was completed just before the First World War. This new facade, finished in 1914, is the Buckingham Palace exterior that people recognise today. It was the third major facade the palace had received in less than a century. Each time, the previous work had proven inadequate. World War II brought different costs. German bombs struck Buckingham Palace multiple times. On September 13, 1940, raids destroyed the chapel and damaged other areas of the palace. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, were home but unharmed. The bombing created a strange bond between the royal family and ordinary Londoners. The palace had been hit like their homes. Shared danger created shared experience. After the war, the destroyed chapel became the site for the Queen's Gallery, opened in 1962 to exhibit works from the royal collection. The late 20th century brought new challenges. Modern standards required updating electrical systems, plumbing, heating. The palace had 775 rooms, 19 staterooms, 240 bedrooms, 92 offices, 78 bathrooms. Maintaining the structure required constant work. By 2017, a comprehensive 10-year renovation plan was announced. Cost £369 million. Over $700 million, the work would update infrastructure to 21st century standards. New wiring throughout, new plumbing, a new energy system, office space, accessibility improvements, including elevators, making the palace safer and more functional for its role as working building, residence, and tourist attraction. Annual costs continued climbing. In 2021 to 2022, the royal household spent £112.3 million. £54.6 million went to Buckingham Palace refurbishment. £41.6 million covered core operating costs, including £23.4 million in staff salaries. £16.1 million covered property maintenance beyond the major refurbishment. The sovereign grant, funded from profits of the Crown Estate, provided £86.3 million. Commercial income added £9.9 million. The household ran a deficit of £16.1 million, drawn from reserves. These numbers prompted criticism. Anti-monarchy groups argued that during cost of living crises, spending over £100 million per year on the royal household was excessive. Supporters countered that the Crown Estate profits far exceeded what the monarchy received, that the Treasury nets billions while the household receives millions, that the palaces draw tourism revenue that benefits Britain's economy. Both arguments contained truth. The debate continued. The mathematical reality remained. Buckingham Palace costs enormous amounts to operate. The building requires 775 rooms to be heated, lit, cleaned, maintained. It requires staff to manage ceremonies, events, administrative work. It requires security. It requires constant repairs to aging systems and structure. The 10-year refurbishment, addressing critical infrastructure problems, will cost £369 million. After that, maintenance will continue at similar levels indefinitely. This is what George IV could not see when he had demanded his palace. This is what John Nash could not explain when asked why costs spiraled. A palace is not just expensive to build, it is expensive forever. Every year it stands, it consumes resources. The larger and grander it is, the more it demands. George wanted a building that would announce British power and his own magnificence. He got it, but the cost of that announcement was a financial burden that never ends. The palace today functions as office, residence, ceremonial venue, and tourist attraction. Over 50,000 guests pass through annually for ceremonies, state visits, investitures, garden parties. During summer, when the royal family is not in residence, the state rooms open to tourists. Hundreds of thousands visit each year, paying admission that contributes to palace funding. The building that was designed for royal exclusivity now depends on public access for financial survival. The irony would not have been lost on George IV. He built a palace to demonstrate that he stood above ordinary people. That palace now opens its doors to those same ordinary people because their admission fees help pay for its upkeep. The building, designed to announce permanence and power, now survives through adaptation and compromise. This is the pattern that defines British country houses and royal palaces. What was built for exclusive splendour survives only through becoming inclusive. Nash's architectural vision remains visible in the staterooms he created. The white drawing room where Victoria and Albert once received guests, the music room where royal christenings happen, the blue drawing room leading to the ballroom. These spaces preserve the theatrical grandeur Nash designed 200 years ago. The scale still impresses. The decoration still dazzles. But now visitors walk through these rooms with audio guides, part of managed tours that limit numbers and protect the furnishings. The rooms were designed for royal glamour. They now serve as museum galleries displaying a vanished way of life. Victoria's death in 1901 marked a transition. Edward VII immediately commissioned redecoration, covering Nash's polychromatic decoration with white and gold interiors that remain today. These changes created the Belle Epoque elegance the staterooms display now. But some felt Edward's heavy redecorations were at odds with Nash's original work. Each generation altered what came before, adapting the building to contemporary taste while erasing earlier visions. The palace tells its story through these layers. The 1703 core of Buckingham House still forms the centre. Nash's 1826 transformation wrapped around it. Bloor's 1847 east wing enclosed it. Webb's 1914 refacing updated it. 21st century infrastructure upgrades modernise it. The building is less a unified design than an accretion of changes, each generation solving problems created by the previous generation while creating new problems for the next. This is the dark story the palace reveals to those who look past the pageantry. Behind every gilded room stands a bill. Behind every ceremonial occasion stands months of preparation by dozens of staff earning modest wages. Behind the family appearing on the balcony stands a building consuming millions of pounds annually just to remain functional. The grandeur is real. The costs are real. Both exist together, inseparable. George IV wanted to build something that would last forever and demonstrate his reign's magnificence. He succeeded. Buckingham Palace stands as Britain's most recognisable royal building, the backdrop for national celebrations and royal events. It appears in countless photographs, paintings, films. It defines how people imagine British monarchy. In that sense, George's dream came true. But the cost of realising that dream destroyed the architect who built it, sparked parliamentary inquiries and created a financial burden that continues 200 years later. The palace cost £496,000 to build, unfinished. It now costs over £100 million per year to operate. The expense never stops. John Nash died in debt in 1835, his reputation ruined by the building he created. George IV died in 1830 without seeing his palace completed. William IV refused to live there. Only Victoria made it her home, and she immediately complained it was inadequate. Every attempt to solve one problem created others. Every renovation proved temporary. The building designed for eternal grandeur requires eternal maintenance. This is the mathematics of palaces that kings never acknowledge and architects cannot avoid. Beauty is expensive. Grandeur is expensive. Maintenance is expensive. Staff are expensive. Heating is expensive. Everything is expensive. The only question is who pays and for how long they are willing to keep paying. For Buckingham Palace, the answer is that Britain keeps paying. The building has become too important to abandon, too symbolic to demolish, too famous to replace. So the costs continue, decade after decade, century after century. June 30th, 1830. Morning light fell through windows that had cost more than most men would earn in a lifetime. The architect stood in the unfinished palace, knowing his career was over. His king was dead. The treasury was coming. The numbers told a story he could not defend. Within 5 years, Nash would be dead. Within decades, his original facades would be modified or replaced. But the core of what he built would remain, along with the costs it imposed on everyone who came after. This is how Britain built its most expensive home. Not through wisdom or careful planning, but through royal ambition, overwhelming financial reality. The palace stands today, not because the project succeeded, but because abandoning it would mean admitting the waste. So Britain maintains what George commissioned, renovates what Nash built, and continues paying for a monument to excess, disguised as a symbol of permanence. If you enjoyed this investigation into the hidden costs behind royal splendor, please like and subscribe. The next exploration awaits. Thank you for watching.